I'm just having my glass of water to get me ready.
Ciao bambini.
Good morning and welcome to our whole school assembly.
Hola!
Let's get some learning on.
Welcome to another day of home learning.
What time is it?
So we're going to work out the volume of this spring roll.
And they're all over the floor.
I consist of 95% water.
We learn grammar through the coolest tool, music.
Super cool.
Godt arbejde i dag, Leo.
I just need to keep it up. I'm so proud of you. It's well done.
Hello everyone and welcome to this session today where we're going to explore using Chromebooks with Microsoft 365. My name's Andy Caffrey. I'm a Google certified innovator and certified trainer and I'm going to be taking you through the session today as we explore the strange crossover world of both using the Chromebooks but also with the Microsoft 365 environment. So that's really what today's webinar is focusing in on. And a lot of people say, well, why are we doing this webinar? Why would we do a webinar on behalf of Google where we talk about Microsoft 365? Well, we know what Chromebooks are like. We know the strength that Chromebooks have as a device on their own. And for anyone who's experienced and used Chromebooks before, you probably know that they have a huge range of benefits for use in the education space. So small, lightweight devices at a lower cost, fast boot up times, 10 seconds or so, with a battery that lasts all day, and they're designed to be simple, affordable, secure and shareable. So there are lots of reasons why Chromebooks are great devices. But of course, not every school wants to use Google Workspace. Some schools are very focused on one platform, and that might be Microsoft 365. Even if you're in a Microsoft 365 environment, Chromebooks can still be a great solution for your learners. So we really wanted to show some of the power about how those can cross over in many respects and how we can use both. But also it's important to recognize that sometimes people are in a mixed environment. So sometimes schools want to pick the best apps from both areas. I previously was a geography teacher, taught geography in a secondary school for 15 years. And so some of the tools that exist, and the one that springs to mind for me is Google Earth. There isn't an opposite similar tool within the Microsoft suite. Sometimes you might want to pick, maybe you're going to heavily use Microsoft 365 apps like Word, PowerPoint and Excel, but sometimes you might want to dip into some of the apps that are offered by Google Workspace. So that ability to sort of chop and change is also there for people who have got access to both. So lots of reasons why you might be in this situation, but today's webinar is very focused on sort of that crossover and using the tools together. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to firstly talk about single sign-on, which is how do we use Microsoft 365 sign-on to sign on to a Chromebook, and then obviously access to both the Google services and the Microsoft services. So single sign-on means we're putting all our users through the same sign-on experience each time. And today we're going to focus in using Microsoft's sign-on for that. We're also going to talk about some of the device settings. So if you're using Chromebooks, what is the best way to configure your devices and if they're going to be used for heavily Microsoft use. And then the last part of that is we'll talking about Chromebooks. We'll focus on, well, what apps, how can we push apps out? Which apps should we push out? Which apps we want to pin and have on that device to make that environment friendly for use with Microsoft 365. So that's the aim of today. A few things. If you've got any questions, feel free to drop your questions in the chat, just straight in the YouTube chat. But we're also running a Q&A doc today, and the link there is on the screen. It's bit.ly/CB365QA. And if there's any questions you want to answer, particularly of a technical nature, pop them in the doc. After today's session, if I don't get the chance to answer questions, all the questions verbally within the session, I will go through the doc later on and drop in responses or links or relevant additional information into that doc. So if there are quite a few of you watching today, so if I don't get the chance to answer everyone's questions, feel free to drop them in the doc and then just revisit that doc at some point, maybe tomorrow, and hopefully your answer will be in the doc for you. So don't forget, throughout the session, you can put questions in YouTube, and you can also put questions in the Q&A doc. I will mention some of the resources as we go, and I've put links to those resources in the Q&A doc already as we go through today's session. So hopefully that's useful to people. Let's dig in and get started with the content. Before I do, I always do a few disclaimers at the start. Today, we're going to be speaking about using the Google admin console, the Google Workspace admin console. And so if you don't have access to that, you're obviously welcome to watch and learn about some of the settings and some of the changes, but you might need to report back to someone in your school if you want to ask about getting any of these changes made. So we're going to be talking about the Google Workspace admin console. And because we're doing both, we're also going to be talking about the Microsoft's admin area, in particular Azure Active Directory, when we talk about syncing users and single sign-on. So to be able to properly set this up, you need access to both areas. If it's not you in the school, if you're watching this from a point of view of a teacher, maybe you've got network support, this should give you some information to go back and talk to them afterwards. I would also add that today's webinar, although we're recording it live right now, is available to watch again anytime on this link. So if after today you want to go back, sit and slowly work your way through some of the settings and some of the options, you can just revisit the YouTube page that you're on right now to rewatch this webinar at any time, or share it with someone. If you need someone in your network team to make changes after what we talk about today, you could share the link with them so that they could go in and make changes. So feel free to share this YouTube video with people. So you'll need access to those two areas. Therefore, I have my usual big disclaimers that I have at the start of any technical session we do, and that is this, that if you go making changes, if you're sitting there now and you start pressing buttons in either of those areas, in the Microsoft or the Google admin consoles, you're going to affect your users who are probably live right now working. So take care, think changes through carefully, and always start small where possible. That's my advice on making changes. And the other thing is always communicate those changes with other people. It's very rare that someone who's looking after admin is working in isolation of teachers and other network staff. So always plan out and talk to the rest of your team about changes you want to make or plan to make, particularly with big changes that we're going to talk about today, like the whole sign-in experience for users is a fairly large change and would need some careful planning if you're going to make that change, so your current users were aware of what's going to happen. Okay, so disclaimers done. Now let's get into some of the content that we're going to talk about today. So the first thing we want to talk about is this idea of SSO single sign-on. And the idea that a user can sign on, in this case, using the Microsoft 365 sign-on page, and then get access to a Chromebook and to all the Google services that they want to access or are turned on for them, as well as all the Microsoft services. They're coming through one single sign-on point, rather than having to sign on to Google over here to do Google things and sign on Microsoft over here to do Microsoft things. So bring it into one sign-on point, and we're going to focus in on using Microsoft for that. So that's the first part which we're going to talk about, first part we're going to cover today. So let me just get my screen in here. And I'm going to start this journey over in the Microsoft area. What we want to achieve is basically this, that when we power up our Chromebook, rather than going to the Google sign-on, that we're presented with a Microsoft sign-in for our users who are familiar with that environment to be able to sign on to that device. And that's the sort of the end outcome of these changes we're going to talk through. So how do we go about doing that? First thing we need to do is a bit of work over in Microsoft side. So I'm here in Microsoft Azure's Active Directory Admin Center. And this is where effectively Microsoft's admin world lives. And over on the left-hand side here, we've got a section called Enterprise Applications. So we're going to the Azure Admin Center. We're going to Enterprise Applications. And at this point, there is a particular application you can use called Google Cloud G Suite Connector tool, which is just there. It's on my list because I've already added it, but you might need to go to new application and just find it from the list of applications the first time that you want to use it. If I then click on that, it takes me into this tool built by Microsoft to help this process. And as you can see, this really nicely, it's a really sort of nice user interface here that breaks it down into simple steps that I can go through to enable my Microsoft Azure Active Directory to talk to Google and set up that single sign-on. And so there's some different areas here, but the one I want to focus on at the moment, just to get started, is this set up single sign-on over here, because that's what I want to do. I want to set up single sign-on for my users. So I click on that. And this is effectively going to give me the settings that I need for my Google Workspace admin console to set up single sign-on. So what it's doing here is it's giving me, particularly in this area here where it talks about the certificate and the settings, and down here the URLs I need, it's giving me the information I need to go over to Google and put that information in to set up my single sign-on. So I've got the information I need there. I'm going to just move that over to the left-hand side of my screen, so I can get it pinned to my left, pin it over there. And then I'm going to just go over to the admin console in Google to be able to paste some of that information across. So that's all the information I'm going to need to use in a minute already for me. Let's go over to Google, into the admin console. Here I am in the Google admin console now. So I'm going to be bouncing between the two. And I want to go set up single sign-on down to security. And then on this page, I want to scroll down until I see single sign-on. And what I want to do is I want to set up a single sign-on with a third party. The third party we're going to use is Microsoft. So that's what I want to do here. And this is where I need to enter the information. So this is where I'm simply going to paste the information that Microsoft have provided with me on that previous page into this area here. So I do want to set this up. So I'll tick that box. Then I need a sign-in page URL. So I pop over here, and helpfully, very, very helpfully, there are some copy buttons to help me get in there. So that's the login URL. So that's that one there. Copy that to clipboard. Come back over to Google, paste it in. I then need a sign out URL. So I'll go back over there, pick out the logout URL, copy to clipboard, come back over, paste it in here. And then you need a certificate. So we need to upload a certificate that's going to bind our domains together. So again, over here, you'll see here it's got the certificate, download. So I can download the certificate down to my device. Up over here. Actually, I've already got one in there because I've obviously practiced this more than once, but I'll replace it to make sure we've got the correct one. And just drop the certificate in. It will be my recent downloads. Here it is. It will be this one here. Most recent download. Press open. And so my certificate's in there now. And finally, I need to tick use a domain specific issuer. And finally, I need to press save. Now, bear in mind that the minute I do this, I am changing the sign-in page for everybody across my whole domain. So at this point, from this point on, if somebody's going onto this domain, they're going to be faced with the Microsoft sign-in page, not the Google one. It's going to take them over. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. So this is an instant change once we press this button. So we've got to really plan this carefully. You know, we wouldn't necessarily in the middle of a school day just randomly have a go and hit the button. We need to plan the timing out that carefully and the messaging out that carefully. So because I'm in a training domain here, and by the way, both of these domains are test domains. I'm not playing on any live school domains. I can safely press save for the moment, and that will go through, make the changes, and it has now changed my sign-in page. Now let's have a look at what that looks like. I'll just open up an incognito window for now. Just to check that's working. Go over to Google, hit sign in. I'm going to just try and sign in with a user from that domain. So I'll go in with a test. I've got a test user in there. Test at G. So this is a test user. Put my details in there. And you see at that point, it says, well, this user is going to single sign on. So as you can see, it's instantly taking me over to the Microsoft page to start the process of signing in with Microsoft. So as soon as I use from that domain now, it's a Google sign-in box. It's switching them over and taking them over to the Microsoft sign-in page. One little tip at this point. I see a lot of people do this. I've come back one again. What they do at this point when they go to test it is they naturally use their own account. It's very natural, isn't it, to use your own account. So I put my Andrew account in here, which is my account, and I press next. You notice that this one doesn't single sign on, it takes me back to the Google page. The reason for that is that account is a super admin account. So super admin accounts don't. All other accounts in my domain will now, if someone tries to sign on a Microsoft page, it will redirect them to on a Google page, it will redirect them to Microsoft. But for the super admin accounts, they stay within the G Suite sign-on system. And there's a very obvious reason why that is. If I've made any other errors in the system, if my domains aren't synced properly, I would lock everybody out and I wouldn't be able to get back in to resolve the issue. And so super admins stay outside of that system. They always sign in through the Google sign-in, so they can always get back to the admin console should anything, between those two setups go wrong. So that's useful to know. It's useful to know because often when people come to this page, they test it with an admin account. And it's also useful to know if you've got any teachers out there. When I was teaching, I was a teacher. My account was super admin. And as a result, I didn't go through the single sign-on changes. So we can test that. We can see that's working at this point. So we know we're good in terms of the settings to start processing that single sign-on. So I will now close that down for a minute and come back to I just want to come back across to my Microsoft area just to point out a couple of things. So behind the scenes, what's happening there is that now when a user wants to sign into Google, they're being presented with a Microsoft sign-in, and then they're signing in through that to access services. That means our users have to match. Our users across the two domains have to match. So the user that's in the Microsoft Active Directory has to match the users in the G Suite admin console. We need to have a match on usernames. To enable that to happen, there's a couple of different ways people do that. I know we're doing this webinar for UK schools, and lots of UK schools use third-party tools to bring their users in. So if you're using a tool like Wand, or if you're using a tool like any of the sync tools like Salamander, you might be bringing your users in from your MIS and popping them in both, in which case you may well have a perfect match already. Microsoft also provide a tool should you want to use it. So here in the Microsoft area, if I come back one, we can see that the various tools we were talking about sign on there, but there's also an option here to use Microsoft's tool to provision user accounts. So that can take all of my users inside Active Directory and go and provision them over in the Google area. So I could rely on Microsoft to make that sync for me. And lots of different ways of getting my users in the two to match. A couple of things I would say about this Microsoft tool here, just to be aware of. So it works its way through and it looks for changes, and it runs every 45 minutes, I think, by default. The default timing is on it. And that means if a user is brand new and they start straight away, there might be a slight delay in them being provisioned over into the Google domain. And the other part about that is it provisions around 50 people a minute. So if, again, you're putting huge numbers in straight away, it's going to take a bit of time to actually do that provision the first time round. So just bear that in mind. So we've talked a little bit about just the sign-on page. I'm going to come back and talk about how that works on device in just a second. But I can see lots of things in the chat that I want to jump on and answer already. So I'm going to just do a couple of questions from the chat. So somebody asked here, can you do this the other way around? So they're signing with Google Workspace on the Chromebook and then single sign into Microsoft 365. And the very simple answer is yes. There is an option to do it exactly the other way around as you're suggesting there. And so you use Google as controlling single sign-on, and then that brings you into both services. Yesterday, I did a webinar with Roger Nixon from Wheatley Park, and he's using Google across the whole of his multi-academy trust, and he uses the Google sign-in. Even on his Windows machines, he uses Google sign-on. So I put a link to that webinar on the Q&A doc. So on the Q&A doc at the top, there is a link to the webinar from yesterday, and that's effectively talking about doing the whole thing the other way around. So feel free to use that link, watch that back, see what Wheatley Park are up to. So that's that question. And then a really good question came in from Yasmin. Can this be configured for a group of users only, or is it domain level only? So just a quick explanation of that. So when we're over in the admin console, you can see at this point, I have to make this change for my entire domain. So right now on the I want to say 15th of March, is it? I can't remember the date off the top of my head. 16th of March. It is only possible to turn this on and off at a big domain level. As you can imagine, it would be far more useful if we could do this for groups of users. And there's some really obvious use cases for that from schools. Maybe you've got your teachers on Office 365 and your students are all using Google. So there's a really logical reason why you might want your teachers going off in that direction and signing in through Microsoft and your students not. At the moment, it's a whole domain setting. Google are in the process of, I would say, working on or launching or getting very close to launching the ability to do this page by organizational unit. And so watch this space. And the reason I mentioned the date was because if you're watching this video and it's May, June, July time, you might want to consider firstly checking that there isn't now an option in this page for doing this by organizational unit. Because if there is, it means you can do this with particular groups of students. So coming soon is how I would describe that feature. So that's answered a couple of questions there. Hopefully, let's come back in. So at this point, we've reached the point in our setup where our users, whenever they want to go to Google, as soon as they put their username in, it's going to take them to the Microsoft page. But if you like, they're double typing there, aren't they? They're putting their username in to go to a page, put the username in again. They're going through it almost twice. And with Chromebooks, we want to smooth that process a bit more, because we already know if the Chromebook belongs to the school and we already know we want to sign with Microsoft, we don't necessarily need to have that. Let's go to Google first, put it all in before it recognizes the single sign-on. We can bypass one of those steps with Chromebooks. So let's click through. So what I'm now going to talk about is the device settings in the admin console that we might want to change to remove that step. Before I do, I just want to get into or explain a little bit about the different types of Chromebooks and the two big differences that we need to understand when it comes to using Chromebooks. Because effectively, you can almost describe it as two different types of Chromebooks out there. So we could have an open device. Let's imagine I went to my local computer shop and I said, can I buy a Chromebook? And they just sell me a Chromebook and I just come home with it. It would be a fairly open device. It wouldn't be controlled or managed by anybody. And that means on the sign-in page, I could sign into any account. I could just press the guest mode button and sign in without an account. It's what we call an open device. And on those sort of devices, the restrictions only come in when the user signs in. In education, more likely, we don't go to a computer shop and buy a Chromebook randomly. Normally, we go through a reseller and we buy a Chromebook and we buy with it the Chrome Education Upgrade. And that allows us to control the device from the moment it's powered up. And that's particularly important to us in this case, because if we want to change the sign-in screen, we obviously need to have that control on the device from the moment it's powered up. So the bit I'm about to talk about would only apply to people if you're using a Chromebook and you have a what's called a Chrome Education Upgrade. It used to be called Chrome Management License, but Chrome Education Upgrade on that device. So you've got that device, you've enrolled it, and it's fixed and bound to your domain, which means we can now start in the admin console to make changes to our device settings. So I wanted to just mention that piece first, because if you haven't, if you just got a Chromebook that you've got from somewhere else without an education upgrade on it, then you won't be able to change the sign-in page. But as soon as users put their password their username in, it's still going to bounce them across, like we saw in that window earlier. So let's now get into my settings. So back to my Google admin console. I'm just going to go back up to the page. And at this point, of course, it signed me out. Because the admin console is very sensitive to changes, and it's very sensitive to any activity. Even if you're working away, every so often it will make you sign back in again. And you can imagine why, from a security point of view, if someone's suddenly going through and making changes all over the admin console, you want to make sure that's legitimate. So it will happen a few times. Okay. Here I'm on the admin console homepage. There's a new version of this rolling out right now. I don't seem to have it on this account yet. But I'm going to go to the side menu. I'm going to go to devices and Chrome, because my Chromebooks are Chrome devices. And what I want to do on this list here is I want to look at the device settings, because those device settings is what's going to happen when we press the power button and the device starts up. So I want to make some changes there. So it's reminding me that this domain hasn't got any Chrome devices in, which is fine. It will still let me go into this because I'm using my training domain. And then there's some options on this page of different things that I can choose to have set. So I'll just scroll down a bit as I go through. So I will mention some that will still be relevant regardless of which account you're using. Disabled device return instructions is always a useful setting. It's what comes up on the screen if you lock the device. I've got a very default please return it statement there, but you probably want to say where you're returning it to, maybe the contact details of your school, who the device should come back to should it be turned off. So we've got that there. If I just come down a bit, just below that, sign on settings. So this is where we want to make some changes on the device. And what we want to do down here a little bit further down in sign on is this bit, single sign on. We know we want to use a different single sign on than the normal one. So rather than the default screen at this point, when the Chromebook powers up, we want to take users to directly to our single sign-on page, which in this case is our Microsoft page. So that's the setting that is going to change the Chromebook so that they won't have to go through that step of typing the address in and then seeing the second page. It will now redirect them to that page. And while we're at this, we should also do the transfer of cookies, just so that the device stays signed on. So we just want to turn those two over the other way. Now you'll notice on this page on the left-hand side, we can do this by organizational unit. So at this point, we can say it's this group of devices, maybe it's all the staff Chromebooks or all the student Chromebooks. So at this point, we can make changes based on organizational units on the device. So making those two changes there and then hitting the save button. Remember, in the admin console at Google, everything in Google often auto saves, but this is the one area where I frequently will make changes and forget to press save. So hit the save button, it makes those changes. And now a Chromebook in my domain, I did this at the very top level. So every device inside my domain is now going to go to the default sign-in page for my domain from the moment it powers on, which in this case would be the Microsoft 365 page. So I've now reached a point where a user in my domain comes on, powers up a Chromebook, 8 to 10 seconds later is faced with the Microsoft 365 sign-in page to access that device. So we've achieved sort of the first step of just making that sign-in route a bit quicker for them. In terms of what I've just gone through there is, and I've put a link in the Q&A doc to this. At the top of the Q&A doc, I've put a link up here. There is a step-by-step guide. It's this top link here, Azure Active Directory single sign-on. Lots of people on that doc. But at the top of the page there is a step-by-step guide written by Microsoft that really just takes you through what I've just talked about. So it takes you through doing that single sign-in process, going to the tools and mapping the two across so you can do that. So we've now got to a point where our users are coming onto a Chromebook, the Chromebook's starting up, and the next thing we need to talk about is apps and extensions. So what we need to talk about next is, well, okay, so my users coming onto the Chromebook, what sort of experience do we now want to give them on that device? What do we want to change? What do we want to turn off and turn on? So I'm going back into my admin console. I'm going to come back to the home page. And I'm going to start by talking about the central apps, which are down here under apps. So these are the web-based apps that Google has within its offering. And really, this is a matter of you making a decision on, are you going to use any of them? In which case, are you going to turn them on or off? And so, as I said before, this is a trained domain, so I think everything's turned on at the moment. But you'd make a decision as to whether you were going to use them and whether they were going to be turned on and off in your organization. Because remember, even though our users are single signing on with their Microsoft account, behind the scenes, that's signing them into Google and bringing them through. So at that point, if they come onto this domain, they're going to have everything turned on, which maybe what you want, and maybe it isn't. Maybe you don't use Gmail. Maybe you're using Outlook, so maybe I could take Gmail off. Maybe we're not going to use Google Meet. Maybe we're using Teams. So again, we go through and potentially turn off the services in core services here that you don't want to use. So we could go through this, decide which ones we were going to use, not use, and make that decision and then turn them off. And that means as our user comes onto the device, they're only going to have access to the things we want them to use. So Google Apps, that's the first step. Google Apps, turning them on and off, making some decisions around that as an organization. And the same with the additional Google services. Now, I said this earlier as when we came to the intro, of course, there are some services that there aren't common similar apps for. It's very obvious that you could look at Google Docs and Microsoft Word, and you can simply make a decision as to which of those two you're going to use. They're very similar in terms of operation and what they do. But there are some, of course, that are very unique to one organization or the other. So in the Microsoft world, things like Sway, Google Sites and Sway are not that similar. Sway is a really sort of unique tool, great for the creation of content. Over in the Google world, as I said earlier, things like Google Earth are fairly unique. Things like we're seeing Apply Digital Skills on this page. You've got things like Blogger. And then on the second page of these additional services, things like YouTube. So there's a whole load of Google services, again, that you might decide, even though you're heavily going down this sort of the 365 route, that you want to have access to those. And so again, you come through additional services and make a decision based on your organization as to which ones to turn on or off. And in terms of this one, it really comes down to your own school and your own choices. There's no set like list. Sometimes people say, which one should be on and off? It comes down to you to sort of work through, potentially with your teaching and learning staff, to think about which apps you want access to. Some general rules on this one, I would say anything that's about sort of buying things, ads, AdWords, all that, you will certainly want that turned off. Some of the educational tools you might well want to leave on. And there's some great stuff in here. Socratic's still on here. There's a wonderful maths app called Socratic that helps students with their maths homework. Again, fairly unique in its space. So again, just coming through here, making those decisions as to what to turn on and off within the additional services. So my steps are, okay, deciding what I want the Chromebook to have access to in that way, firstly. So that's my first step. And then the next thing I want to do is I presumably want to then replace some of this. If I'm turning off Google Docs, I now want to replace that with Microsoft Word in some way. So come back to the home page of the admin console. We've now turned off the ones we don't want to use from Google. We're now going to turn on the ones we want to use, or push out the ones we want to use from Microsoft. So back over to my devices. In fact, I'll go to the side menu and go to devices that way, and Chrome. And then on this list here of things I can do with my devices, we've got apps and extensions. So I need to think about, well, what apps and extensions do my users need to use? And when that Chromebook comes on, it's appropriately set up for them to use. So here we are on the apps and extensions page. And once again, on the left-hand side, we see our different groupings of people, our organizational units that exist. So again, we can have a different setup for students and a different setup for staff. So maybe staff are using slightly different apps than students. We can create that setup here on this point. So I'm on my apps and extensions page, hit the plus button, and it gives me a series of options here. So just to explain the different options we have that we're going to push to the Chromebook, we've got the Chrome Web Store. So that's web-based apps and extensions. We've got the Play Store, which are Android apps. We've got ID extensions, Chrome extensions by ID, which is only sort of hidden Chrome extensions. Not likely going to use any of those. They tend to be the security type extensions. So if you're monitoring Chromebooks, that's the time you might come to that option. And then the last one is add by URL, which basically means taking a website that exists on the web and still pinning it, putting it as a button, putting it as an option. So we've got those options there that we can go through to add to our device. So let's go from the start. Start with the Chrome Web Store. As you can see, when I click on this, it brings up the Chrome Web Store and it gives me different things to add. Microsoft to make an Office extension. I probably should have put the word Microsoft in there as well, but there it is, it's come up. So Microsoft themselves make a Chrome extension for Microsoft Office. And I've got it on this device here. So as you can see, it's already installed on my device up here. When I click it, Chrome extensions are little buttons that live up the top right-hand side in the Chrome browser. When I click it, it brings me a nice little menu. Again, it gives me access to all the Microsoft tools. So it's a quick access menu for navigating straight into my tools. I might decide that would be really useful for my for everybody in my domain to have. So come to the plus button, come to add from the Chrome Web Store. So I clicked off it there, so it didn't load. Go to my search again. Office. Click it. And at this point, I'm going to press select because I've decided I want this extension. So it just checks it. And at that point, it brings me to this page. Now, the default setting at this point is allow install. So allow install means all of my users could install it if they want to. It's their choice. I might say, well, actually, I want a bit more than allow install. When they come onto the Chromebook, I want it there. I want everyone to know it's there. I want it to be in the same place for everybody. So what I might decide to do instead is force install it. And force install it means that now when any user in my domain signs on, even though they're coming through the Microsoft route, they're going to have that Office top right-hand side ready for them to use. It's a really nice Chrome extension that helps you on a Chromebook navigate quickly to some of those Office areas. So I've put a link to that Chrome extension in case you can't find it on the top here of the useful links button. The Office Chrome extension I think is worth pushing out as a particular app, as an extension. So that's pushing an extension. Let's push something else now. Let's go and do one from the Play Store. So we did an extension from the Chrome Store. We're going to do one from the Play Store. Oops, I'm in a domain where my Play Store is turned off. Let me see if it'll let me do it. I'll have to go and I need to save first. That's why I didn't save the change on that one. See if you'll let me have Play Store this time. Okay, so the Play Store are Android apps. Now, there is a big debate, I would say, about do you install an Android app or do you install a link or the web app? And really that comes down to personal user choice. So one thing I would say is it's about looking at the individual apps and making a decision. Some of the Microsoft apps have got some different functionality. So do we put in the Android app for Word or do we just go to Word Online and use the tool online? And so in terms of that, it's really down to personal choice, and there are some feature differences between the two. My own personal view is I think the online tools, just going to Word Online, seem to have a bit more functionality than some of the Android apps. But then there are other people I speak to who are much more in the sense of using the Android apps, and it's again your choice. And of course, even though you put an Android app, a user could still go to Word Online and vice versa. So they can still access both. But one that I do think is really useful in terms of pushing out as an Android app is the OneDrive app. So I'm here in my Play Store apps. And I'm going to OneDrive, finding the OneDrive Android app. There it is there. Clicking on it, and it's just like before. Clicking on the OneDrive app, pressing select. And again, it's very similar to where we were last time. It's just asking for permissions at this point. I'll press accept on those permissions. And now I've got the OneDrive app here again. It's on allow install at this point, but I might decide I want my users to have it. So that's force install. Force install and pin is going to make it appear in this bar at the bottom of my Chromebook. So that's like if you've got the highest level that I can do. So I'm going to go force install and pin for this one. And I'm going to put the OneDrive app so that when my users come on to their Chromebook, on the bottom bar here, they've got OneDrive force installed on that device. Now, I was explaining perhaps why do I say OneDrive should come in as Android app. The OneDrive Android app has a really sort of nice additional feature that works well with Chromebooks. And that is this. If I just open up my files on my Chromebook, I've got the OneDrive app installed. So as you can see, because the OneDrive Android app is installed on my Chromebook, when I'm on the Chromebook and I go to files on the left-hand side here, I've got my OneDrive area as well as my Google Drive area. So in this account, by the way, Google, as we know, is still turned on, and I've got OneDrive. So I can actually go between the two on the Chromebook and look at both areas as a file space within that. So I'm getting OneDrive in my files area because the OneDrive app, Android app, is installed on my Chromebook. And that's what, if you like, makes that connection behind the scenes. So again, it's useful for users to be able to access the OneDrive in the file area, because what we're trying to do with this whole process is just make it easy for our end users to get to things, to get to the right tools they want to use. And so the OneDrive Android app helps with that. And again, there it is. And again, it's taking me into my drive, so I can move around and move things between them if I want to as well. So, so that's we were talking about what to press these buttons for. We talked about pushing out things from the Chrome Web Store. We talked about pushing out things from the Google Play Store. We can do that. And then the final one, just to make sure we've covered the list at the top there, is what happens if we just want to push a link out. Oh, I haven't pressed save on this one either yet. Press save. So that goes in. And so let me go to a link now. And this time round, I'm going to just push a link out. So maybe there's some tools within Microsoft that we want to use that don't have an app, or maybe I don't necessarily want the app, but I want them using it in a certain way. So I'm going to go and grab, in this case, I'm going to grab the details for Flipgrid. Flipgrid's a great little video Q&A tool, part of the Microsoft suite. And again, I might want that to be on my, or maybe I'm using that so much in my school that I want a quick link to that. So I've just grabbed Flipgrid's web address. I'm going to make that a button on my device. I want it to open. I can have it open in the browser or a separate window. So I could have it almost appear like an app in its own little window. But for now, we'll have it in the browser and press save. And so now Flipgrid is going to be force installed, and I'm going to force install and pin it. And that means now on my Chromebooks at the bottom, when my users log in, we're going to have OneDrive down there pinned, and we're going to have the Flipgrid icon pinned again to take them straight to Flipgrid. So even when something is just purely a website, I can still make those links, pin them on the bottom, and do it that way. So press save on that one. And so what I'm starting to build is I'm starting to build a customized environment for my students. So what I'm doing is I'm thinking through, well, what apps do you want to use? And again, I'm not going to show you all of them because you can imagine they're all pretty similar, but we could do the very same thing with the PowerPoint, with Word, with Excel, and work our way through the different tools. So I would go through and build my app library, if you like. While I'm on this page, a couple of other things to point out to you. So the first thing is here on the right hand side. In this particular account at the moment, as you can see, it says allow other apps and extensions from the Chrome Web Store. If I was on a domain with students, I probably wouldn't have things wide open that would allow people just to install their own. I would probably change that to block all other apps and extensions. And that means that only the apps and extensions that I decide can be pushed onto that particular device. I happen to be using a trained domain, which is why it's more open, because it's a domain we use for testing. But I would be tempted to say in a school domain, we should be on probably the block level so that people can come to us and say, can you put this extension on? And we can make a decision. We can look at the data policies. We can look at the compliance issues around an app and extension before we decide to push it out to lots of users. So just note about that setting there. So that's putting our apps on the device. So now when our user comes onto the device, they're going to see Word, PowerPoint, Excel icons at the bottom, Flipgrid and OneDrive. They're going to see OneDrive in the area, and we're making the device more appropriate for them if they're using the 365. One final change, and while I go through this, if you've got any more questions, feel free to get them in the chat. But one final change I want to talk about, and that's the home page. So I'm going back to devices. In fact, I'm going to go to my side menu and go to devices in Chrome. And we talked earlier on about making some changes to the device settings. And device settings is what we change when the device powers up before we've even signed on. But we can also make changes to the user and browser settings. And this means once our user signs in, what do we want to have happen? Now, there's a huge number of user settings on a Chromebook. It used to be 200, and I think this year there's 500 different options. So there's a massive list of things on this page that we can go through to make changes, but I'm going to pick on a couple. And the one I want to pick on is when our user comes in, what the home page is, which is quite a long way down. So you can give me a second to get down to it, because what we also probably want to do to make things easier is set our home page to be office.com. I'm still scrolling. That's how many options there are. I hope I haven't gone past it while I was doing this. Got a horrible thing I might have gone past it while I was not looking. I'm not sure why I'm doing it in this slow way. I'll do the fast way and press Control F. I don't know why I'm doing it such a slow way. Home page. Here we go. Okay, let's go down a bit from there. There we go. So here on the home page area, we can see that the home page for this domain is already set to be office.com. And so office.com is this home page. It's the sort of default landing page that anyone using Microsoft 365 is probably very familiar with. It's going to show my recent files, give me quick access to all the apps on the left-hand side here. So a really good sort of starting point for that device, not only to boot up with the things down the bottom here, but to boot on that page as well. So here in the admin console, go and make the home page, office.com. We can also, further down the page here, where it says pages to load on startup, we can also specify when that device comes on, do we want some other pages to load up? So if you're heavy users of Microsoft Teams, maybe you want Teams to come in at that point so they can see their classes and their teams, as well as maybe the Office page, as well as maybe the OneDrive, maybe there's some other tools you want to bring in at that point. So again, we can have a multiple sort of range of pages loading in. So what we're trying to do is create this sort of environment where when our user comes on, they sign on and all these sort of settings are appropriately set around them. So the other thing I would suggest changing is the pages load on startup to bring in Office and to bring in maybe Teams and the other tools that you are using. And so that is making changes to the apps and extensions on our device so that our device is more appropriately set up for use in that environment. Okay, so now I've got a bit of time to start going through some questions in the on the right hand side. So let me pick up some questions and let's see where I'm going to start with those. Questions over. We had so good question here. If they use the Word on the Chrome extension, where does the work get saved? Is it still in Drive as docs would be? It's saved in OneDrive. So if you start a blank document in Word Online, that's saved back into your OneDrive, very similar to Google Docs saves to Google Drive, then that was saved back in OneDrive. So because it's going to go back to OneDrive, and that's where it would be. So again, you can move between devices and access it in that way. So I hope that answers that question. Can you save your school Google Drive from the Word Chrome web app? Can you save to your school Google Drive? You could move the file. But you couldn't save automatically to it. Is my knowledge. I'm sure I'll check that out later, but I'm pretty convinced that it will save automatically to OneDrive. I could go into the files area there and move things around between the two, which we saw earlier, but it won't save back to Google Drive from that area. How can I make the default file location Office 365? How can I make the default file location the Office 365 drive? Admins can control default file locations on Chromebooks, but by default, it's usually downloaded. And even Google users will know that things mostly go into downloads, and then we can move things from there. So off the top of my head, I don't think you can, but pop that in the Q&A doc, and I'll check that one out later and see if there's an alternative solution to that one. Good point from Paul. If you're not one-to-one, stick with web apps. If your shared device, Android, is difficult. So what Paul's hitting on there is that if we've got a device and it's being used by lots of different people and they sign on, and you're then pushing out all these Android apps to that device, then that device is downloading Android apps and they're coming in, they're downloading, and then we've got different, depending on how the device is set up, if we've got the device wiping and being reused, it sort of slows the whole process down. And as I said earlier, I don't think there's a significant difference between the Android apps and the web-based version. And so I'd be tempted to say, where possible, use web. The only time you might find Android a benefit is the offline access. So that's that one. Someone answered the question about saving to OneDrive. Someone mentioning about using the search field in the admin console, which is a very valid point. Thank you for that, Graham. Just checking I've answered all questions. I think I've answered most of the other questions in the chat. We've talked about the community number one, so I think they're nearly all answered. But what I will do, if you've got further questions, as I said before, is I will go into that Q&A doc after today's webinar, and I will go through the questions people have asked and answer anything in there. So if you've got additional questions or you think of something after today, feel free to go over to the Q&A doc and add your questions there. So some final closing points from me then. Useful resources are at the top of the Q&A doc. So there's some 3 links there that are probably of use to you. Don't forget, this is one of a big range of webinars that we are running. This is quite a specialist webinar, but there's one of a big range of webinars we're running at bit.ly/GFE UK events. So you can jump on that link to find out about the range of sessions we're running. And included in there are some sessions where we go through Chromebook settings in a lot more detail than we've done today. So if you're interested in more about the nuances of setting up Chromebooks, you can sign up for one of those sessions there. The other thing I recommend you keep your eye on, because there are some changes potentially coming, as we mentioned earlier, to the single sign-on area, is the Workspace Updates blog. It's at workspaceupdates.googleblog.com, and that's where Google announced changes. So if they're going to allow, for example, single sign-on by Organisational Unit, it would get announced on the Google Workspace Updates page, and you'd know then you could go in and make those changes to your system. So that could be a great place to go to. And you can sign up by email. It's one of the options there is to subscribe by email. And subscribe by email means you get an email when new features come out to Google. So I always recommend people in the technical area follow that blog. That's it for today. A big thank you to everyone for joining us. We have an evaluation form that's coming up in the chat. But otherwise, thanks for today, and we'll see you all soon. Bye, everyone.